Hi there, welcome back, one and all, to Scot Goes Pop. My name is James Kelly. You might have seen on Wednesday, I think it was, that Stuart Campbell wrote yet another lengthy rant about little old me on Wings Over Scotland. I'm deeply touched, Stu. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to kill two birds with one stone because I had been intending to reply to his short response that he made on Twitter to one of my videos from last week, so I can respond to both things now. My video had been talking about Stuart's latest blog post advocating tactical voting in next year's Holyrood list ballot, advocating that everybody should vote against the SNP on a supposedly tactical basis on the list. And I thought it was odd in that article that he kept demanding that people should explain to him how it's possible for the SNP to win list seats next year, as if that's the most impossible thing in the world that you can imagine, whereas in fact it's pretty likely to happen. I thought it was odd that he was making that demand when it became clear during the article that his ultimate objective in putting forward this supposedly tactical voting advice is to bring about the total destruction of the SNP, which of course is a far more fantastical, impossible objective than the rather prosaic task of trying to get the SNP to win a few list seats. It seemed to me that meant there was an obvious delusional aspect to this whole sort of tactical voting project, which meant that there was more of a psychological issue on Stuart's part rather than having anything to do really with the minutiae of the arithmetic, the very misleading arithmetic that he always tries to get into. In his response to me on Twitter, which I can't read out because it contains a four-letter swear word directed as an insult towards me, which is very uncharacteristic of Stuart. I haven't seen that sort of thing from him before. He must have just been having a bad day. You have my sympathy, Stu. But what he said in his tweet was that it actually, it's not delusional to say that the SNP can be destroyed. It's actually extremely easy to destroy the SNP because all you have to do is stop voting for them. You see, this is the brilliant plan. I mean, this is superb. Yeah, he's going to destroy the SNP by getting the over 1 million people who voted for the SNP at the last election just to not vote for them ever again. All of them are just going to stop voting for the SNP. Superb. This is right up there with the greatest political tacticians of the last 2 millennia. I mean, I can exclusively reveal, and this may be a surprise to Stuart, that this is kind of what I meant when I was saying how difficult and how impossible it is that when you've got such a huge number of people who have voted for the SNP over a long period of time, it's become an ingrained habit, come from all different walks of life and various different ideological backgrounds, various different social backgrounds. It is totally unrealistic to think you can just sort of flick a switch and make them all stop voting for the SNP. There's this concept known as the theory of mind, which is the idea that human beings have an insight into the fact that their fellow human beings may have desires and beliefs and preoccupations and fears that differ from their own, and therefore they may react to certain situations very differently from themselves. And it used to be said, for example, that autistic people lacked a theory of mind. That's now a very outdated view, I believe. But nevertheless, it's almost as if Stuart lacks a theory of mind. It's as if he thinks the progression of his own views and attitudes towards the SNP just sort of automatically apply to the rest of the population, that because he's moved away from the SNP, that's just going to apply to everybody else. Literally to everybody else. They are going to be destroyed. People are just going to completely stop voting for them. That previously they voted for the SNP in huge numbers, just suddenly going to stop completely because everybody thinks like Stuart or can be coaxed with not that much effort. If you just sort of direct them in the right way, they'll all think like Stuart. They'll all come to the same conclusion as Stuart because the human condition is to be very like Stuart Campbell. It really is as if Stuart cannot conceive that there are large numbers of people out there for whom Sandy Peggy is not the most important issue that has cropped up since the dawn of human civilization, and who wouldn't think that Sandy Peggy was the most important issue to have cropped up since the dawn of human civilization, even if the issue was properly explained to them. They just fundamentally see it differently from Stuart, and they think other things are more important. For example, the genocide that's going on in Gaza, because people are different. They have their own interests and their own beliefs. I'm not sure Stuart can see that, and I think he does believe that if people just are armed with certain types of knowledge or are coaxed to see things in a certain way, they'll all just fall in line, and he really does believe that he can flick a switch and make people stop voting for the SNP completely. One of the very many bizarre anachronisms of the British Parliament is that when an Act of Parliament reaches royal assent, the exact moment that it becomes law is marked by the reading out of the Norman French words Le Roi Le Veult, or it used to be La Reine Le Veult when the Queen was still with us, which means either the King wills it or the Queen wills it. And well, maybe that should be adapted to Le Stew Le Veult. Stuart thinks that if he wills something, it can be made to happen, but that isn't the way the world works. And surely it's a statement of the obvious that the world does not work that way. I can remember growing up and night after night, my parents would watch Mrs. Thatcher on the news destroying British industry, and they would be appalled and say that this had to stop and have to do something. Why didn't the brilliant idea occur to them that all they have to do is vote against the Conservatives at the next election? Well, it probably did occur to them to do that, but it's not quite enough when you know that there are millions of people in the south of England who just happen to see the situation very differently, and they cannot be coaxed to see the situation in the way you want them to, because their fundamental belief system is different. And that is the case with the SNP. There are actually many, many hundreds of thousands of people who vote for the SNP for reasons that Stuart can't quite understand and probably wouldn't be able to grasp. And they are going to continue to do so no matter how much he shouts at them. And so, no, it is not possible to destroy the SNP, let alone it is not easy to destroy the SNP. You can't do it at all. It is complete and utter fantasy. Okay, so let's now turn to the new blog post that Stuart has written about me, which is called Trying to Understand, in which he poses as a man in a degree of perplexity about the supposed contradictions in my position, but actually mostly what he reveals are the contradictions in his own position. He starts by saying, it can be very hard to follow the arguments of people trying to convince you to vote for the SNP on the regional list at next year's election. Here's one just a month ago, and any quotes from me. So even there, in the first sentence, he's giving you a little fib, because I have not tried to persuade people who are not SNP supporters that they should vote SNP on the list. I've not tried to hoodwink them into thinking that there's some kind of magical reason why they should be voting SNP rather than for the first choice party. It's the other way around. It's people like Stuart who are saying that SNP supporters should abandon their first choice party on the list and vote for some, basically no-hoper parties on the list ballot, which aren't going to win any seats on a tactical basis. Whereas in fact, the list ballot is the more important of the two ballots, because the Hollywood voting system will always attempt to make the overall composition of Parliament proportional to how people vote on the list ballot rather than on the constituency ballot. So, if you vote tactically on the list, and if the SNP win lots of constituencies in your region and therefore don't need any less votes or less seats, then okay, you've been very lucky. But if you aren't lucky, and you won't know whether you've been lucky at the moment you cast your vote, then not giving your first choice party your list vote is going to absolutely hammer them, because they might get a far lower proportion of seats than they are really due in comparison to the popular support that is out there for them. And this has consistently been my position. If you look back to what I've said in previous elections, people have always accused me of pushing both votes SNP, whereas in fact what I've actually been saying is simply don't vote tactically. Tactical voting on the list is a mug's game. Always vote for your first choice party on the list, because it's the more important of the two ballots is the one that determines the overall composition of Parliament. So Stuart goes on to say, so that's clear. Maybe this is based on my quote. So that's clear. Indie supporters must ignore this siren voices telling them to vote for smaller indie parties because those parties can't win any seats, and therefore to vote for them is to throw away your list vote. Yeah, that is my position. That is still my position. I'm looking forward to seeing what the contradiction is supposed to be, Stuart, because that position has not changed one iota. And this was them, that's me again, this was them just 2 weeks ago strenuously insisting that the small parties were a busted flush and there was no chance of a non-SNP route to independence. Quotes me again. So it was a bit confusing to read this yesterday, and then he's talking about the introduction I gave to my video, in which I said that John Swinney's target of an SNP only majority, a single party majority, is totally unachievable, which it is. I see. If this is supposed to be the contradiction, then I'll give you a sneak preview. If this is supposed to be the contradiction, then this is based on a pretty easy misunderstanding to clear up, because I have never argued that the SNP have any realistic chance of winning an overall majority. In reality, it was Stuart who said that the SNP not only could win an overall majority, but that they definitely would win an overall majority. He said they were guaranteed to win a minimum of 65 constituency seats. He said this only 3 or 4 months ago. And so if they win 65, then they've got an overall majority without needing any less seats whatsoever. And I pointed out to him at the time, and he can't have forgotten this, his memory isn't that bad. I pointed out to him at the time that it is completely ludicrous to suggest that they are going to win 65 constituency seats, because there were numerous seats that he was putting in the SNP column and saying they were guaranteed to win, which were extremely ropey for them, most obviously East Lothian, and he couldn't answer that. It was obvious that the SNP are likely to lose East Lothian, and yet Stuart was saying this is one of the guaranteed 65 seats. So I have always been saying that the SNP are going to fall short of an overall majority, where Stuart can't say that for himself. He has been saying within recent weeks that the SNP were going to win an overall majority without requiring any less seats whatsoever. A completely ludicrous position which he backed down from. But to try and say that there's some sort of contradiction on my part, and now saying that there's no chance of an SNP overall majority, whereas in fact I have been consistent on that point and he has not, well, that's a little bit ambitious, Stu. He goes on to say, because all of a sudden it seems that you can vote for the smaller indie parties, regardless of whether they win seats or not, because the list vote will actually be a de facto referendum and the votes will still count. And indeed, apparently you should do so, because an SNP only route, the thing that was the only hope a fortnight ago, is now totally unachievable, and only working in concert with the smaller indie parties can succeed. I mean, where do you start with this nonsense? When did I ever say that an SNP only route was the only way to achieve? I have never said any such thing. I have been consistently saying, unlike Stuart, that the SNP cannot win an overall majority, and that the pro-independence majority, if it is to be won in the next Scottish Parliament, will inevitably have to involve both the SNP and the Greens. But not Alba, but not Liberate Scotland, because as I pointed out yesterday and the day before, and as I have been consistently pointing out, Alba and Liberate Scotland have no realistic chance whatsoever of winning any seats. Nothing has changed. My position has not changed. It's also a complete lie for him to suggest that I had in any way claimed that you should vote for pro-independence parties and that this was some sort of change in my position. I have not said that at all. What I said was that if the election was used as a de facto referendum, then to get to a 50% plus one list vote would involve the SNP taking the lion's share of that, being probably somewhere in the 30s. You would need the Greens to be by far the second biggest contribution, somewhere in the teens, and then the very small pro-independence parties that aren't going to win any seats, they might have a small contribution to get you over that 50% plus one, which is a statement of the obvious, because if you look at 2021, when there was actually a pro-independence majority on the list ballot, just about. Say, for example, without Alba's 1.7% of the vote or whatever it was, then it would have fallen short of 50%. If it's tight, then yeah, votes for very small parties are part of that overall majority. But that doesn't mean that I am advocating that you should vote for the smaller party rather than the larger one. It makes far more sense to vote for the larger one because then your vote is going to be seen as more emphatic. I'm just living in the real world and saying that if you think you're probably only just going to barely get over the 50% mark if you do it, then obviously you can't afford to squander even 0.1% that might be going to liberate Scotland or whatever. It's just a statement of the obvious, but it categorically is not me advocating voting for these no-hoper parties, and you will search in vain for any evidence I have said this. This is Stuart Campbell in full-on propaganda mode once again. And as for this idea that you should vote for the smaller parties because their votes will still count towards the majority, no, that doesn't make sense at all because they might count towards the majority, but you also want to win seats. And so if you're thinking about what makes the most tactical sense, you would vote for a party that can contribute those votes to a majority, but can also contribute seats to that majority that you need in Parliament. And self-evidently, Alba and Liberate Scotland are not going to make that sort of contribution. So it makes far more sense to vote for the larger pro-independence parties rather than the smaller ones. He goes on, heavens, what huge transformative event did we miss? Then he sort of admits that it actually was the obvious point that John 20 made an announcement that nobody saw coming. But Stuart says all 20 did was confirm explicitly what both votes SNP advocates had been demanding all along. Well, that's certainly not true. There's plenty of people who have been advocating both votes SNP who think that what John 20 has proposed is incredibly silly. But Stuart goes on to say, which of the strategies is in fact achievable? Let's look at the numbers. Pretty much every analysis of current polling agrees that the SNP are currently in line for somewhere between 50 and 60 constituency seats. It's very difficult how they could credibly get below 50. Well, I mean, it's only a few weeks since he was saying that it was impossible for them to fall below 65 constituency seats. So if you can drop from 65 to 50 within only a few weeks, then I think it's entirely possible. And in fact, it's a statement of the obvious, in fact, that there are plenty of scenarios in which the SNP could get less than 50 seats. And surely, if Stuart thinks it's possible to destroy the SNP, to go back to the point earlier, just by clicking his fingers or flicking a switch, and he's actually telling people that they should vote tactically against the SNP on the constituency ballot as well as the list ballot. So if he thinks it's so possible to change public opinion so dramatically, so quickly, then of course he has to accept that it's entirely possible that the SNP will do extremely poorly in the constituency ballot and win very few constituency seats. This is a fundamental contradiction in his position. If he thinks it's possible to destroy the SNP, he thinks it's impossible to make so many people stop voting for the SNP simultaneously, how can he possibly say the SNP are guaranteed to win more than 50 seats? It doesn't make sense to you, and you know it doesn't make sense. He goes on to say, because according to the both votes SNP loonies, that's me again. I don't know why he bothers using the plural, he's just talking about me. 2026 represents the SNP's best opportunity to win list seats since 2007. Yeah, of course it is. The list seats are distributed on a compensatory basis. If the fewer constituency seats you win, the more scope there is to win list seats. And if the SNP's constituency vote has fallen significantly, as it has, then there's a chance that the SNP will win fewer constituency seats, and that opens up more scope for list seats. This is not exactly rocket science. 54 plus 17 is 71, 5 more than you need for a Hollywood majority. So if the loonies, me, are telling the truth about the list vote, then an SNP-only majority is in fact perfectly achievable, even on current polling. Well, yeah, if I had said anything about the SNP winning 54 constituency seats and 17 list seats, then yeah, that would make sense. But as I didn't say either of those things, I didn't use any of those numbers, not so much, Stu. Not so much. So what about the alternative plan, he said? Polling for the list vote in 2021. Looks like that's why we're talking about 2021. Blah blah blah. We'll be super generous. I think he means 2026. I think he does mean next year and not 2021. We'll be super generous and assign all other votes to the pro-Indy side, which gives us an average combined pro-Indy list vote of 42.5%. So what he seems to be saying here, he seems to be saying that because he thinks the pro-independence parties are on course for 42.5% of the list vote, which is 7.5% short of the mandate required. He seems to be saying that the John Swinney plan is in fact more achievable than the de facto referendum plan. And if he doesn't support the de facto referendum plan, then what is he actually talking about at all? Because ALBA are advocating the de facto referendum. Liberate Scotland, I believe, are advocating a de facto referendum. If Stuart doesn't believe in that, then why is he suggesting that people should go off and vote for these smaller parties? It's couldn't possibly be that there's something else in his mind, that he has another agenda, and then in fact he's not interested in delivering independence for Scotland, but in fact he's more interested in getting a reform UK government, and he's just trying to coax his followers who may not want to hear such a direct message into doing what he wants. I mean, could it possibly be that? What I thought. We can't begin to imagine the royal we. Yeah, it's just King Charles and Stuart Campbell. Those are the only people who do it. We can't begin to imagine the level of cognitive dissonance it must require to demand independent supporters give both votes to a party whose leader you yourself say is deliberately forcing it off the agenda for at least another half-decade. Well, I mean, we live in a world where there are a menu of imperfect options. And yes, I intend to vote for the SNP on both ballots. And I would certainly urge anybody whose first choice is the SNP to vote for the SNP on both ballots, because in an imperfect world, the SNP remain the best choice. In other circumstances, I could imagine I would be quite attracted to the Green Party because, they do seem to be genuinely in favour of independence in spite of what people say, and I agree with them about opposition to nuclear power. I certainly agree with them on the Gaza issue. I agree with their total opposition to nuclear weapons. The problem with the Green Party is they've been taken over by this identity politics zealotry, and that makes it just impossible for anyone to get involved with them unless you share those views. Otherwise, you can see that people who differ from those views in any way just get expelled and treated like absolute dirt. And then you've got ALBA, who are this sort of Stalinist authoritarian freak show. They've ruled themselves out by their own extreme behaviour. And then you've got Liberate Scotland, who a large component part of that alliance is a sort of nativist far-right party that wants to restrict citizenship on ethnic grounds. And we've had, I've tried to talk to people in Liberate Scotland to try and get some kind of rationale for this, or to set my mind at rest at this, and they're simply not willing to even engage, which suggests to me that they know this is that they're on weak ground with this, and that they have made a dreadful mistake. When I spoke to Eva Comrie about this on Twitter, and she's someone I respect greatly, every time I asked her the direct question about this far-right party, which is called Sovereignty, she just changed the subject and sort of stuck to this, these moronic slogans: independence, nothing else, nothing less. We'll deal with other stuff after independence. It's not good enough. Sovereignty are not a small part of the Liberate Scotland alliance. I think they're going to make up probably about a third of the candidates. You can't seriously say that there is no cause for concern in the fact that you would, by voting for Liberate Scotland, you'd be electing an alliance which contains 1/3 of people who want to deny citizenship and an independent Scotland to people on an ethnic basis, and who literally want to ban all economic migration. That is an extremist position. You can't tell me it's not a problem that liberates Scotland. It's 1/3 composed of people that have such extreme beliefs. So the reality is that one way or another, the other alternatives to the SNP have all ruled themselves out, and that has left, in my view, the SNP as the only game in town. And all we can really realistically do is try to work from within the SNP to get them back on the right track. And if that doesn't happen before the Holyrood election of 2026, then we'll have to keep trying to do it afterwards. And at some point, I think we will succeed. It's just a question of time, and it might take a long time. It might be incredibly frustrating. But I think if we are going to win independence, it's going to be done through the SNP, because there have been these genuine attempts to come up with something different, some sort of alternative to the SNP, and the people involved have just completely screwed it up. And I can't see where any other alternative is going to come from in the foreseeable future. So that's my latest reply to Stuart Campbell's latest rant about little old me. That's it for now. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. But for now, see you later.